Hello everybody! Today I'm going to talk about my tips, tricks, and websites I use to find the cheapest flights. Here we go. Tip number 1, fly in low season. Now what is low season? Low season is basically not the summer break, not the winter break, basically anytime there's no holiday and kids are in school. Now I know a lot of us are students. Flying in low season doesn't really work for me. So this tip is actually more for people who are taking a year off or are very flexible in their work schedule or are homeschooled. But flying low season, February especially, can have really low prices. Tip number 2. Fly on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. Trying to avoid the weekend, Saturday, Sunday is a given, but also trying to avoid Monday, Friday, and even Thursday sometimes can almost cut the price in half. From my experience, I found that flying Tuesdays are cheaper than flying Wednesdays, but you really just have to be flexible and play around with the dates. Lots of websites let you look at a calendar that shows which days are the cheapest, and you can go from there. Tip number 3, if you live in a smaller city, try looking up airports that are close to you but in bigger cities. For example, if you live outside of Dallas, Texas, you might not want to fly out of the airport that is closest to you, but rather that is bigger. These airports are called hubs, and sometimes they can be cheaper than smaller airports that might be closer to you. So just driving a little more to a bigger airport could actually save you a couple $100s. Okay, tip number 4, fly with different airlines to reach your destination. Now, of course, if you're flying domestically in the US or if you're flying in Europe, if you can fly directly and it's cheaper, go ahead and use that option. But if you're trying to fly internationally, say from Dallas, you want to get to Berlin, then sometimes it's cheaper to fly from Dallas to New York and New York to Berlin than it is to fly directly from Dallas to Berlin. And choosing different airlines for each flight may end up costing you less than if you had just flown directly, or if you had flown from Dallas to New York to Berlin with the same airline. So for example, I'm in Berlin right now and I came here from Austin, Texas, but what I did is I found a cheap ticket on airberlin.com, but that didn't fly from Austin. It flew from New York directly to Berlin, but I had to get from Austin to New York. So what I did was fly with a different airline from Austin to New York, got a cheap ticket, and then flew from New York to Berlin with the inexpensive ticket that I found on airberlin.com. Another tip that actually also goes with that is that you don't have to fly back from the same airport that you flew to. So I mean, if I flew here to Berlin, I don't have to go back to the airport in Berlin to fly back home. I can take a bus to another country. I mean, everything in Europe is pretty close to each other, so you could just take a bus to, say, Paris if the ticket was cheaper from Paris back home. So you see what I'm saying? You don't have to leave at the same airport that you arrived at. And if you ended up doing that, I mean, bus and train tickets in Europe are actually really cheap. If you ended up doing that, then you would also see the city that you took a bus or train to. Tip number 4, take a longer layover. This can kind of be tricky with some airlines, but other airlines, for example, WOW Air, lets you have a longer layover in Iceland. When you're flying internationally from the States to Europe, you can take a longer layover in Iceland and see Iceland for either a day or two. When looking for a flight, never choose multi-city, because multi-city means that you're paying full price for each stop that you're making. But say, for example, your flight ends up having a 12-hour layover in New York JFK, use that time to go out of the airport and explore the city for, 9 hours and get back to the airport before your next flight leaves. So then you've seen a whole new city and you didn't even pay for it. Okay, tip number 5 is about when you should be booking your flight. Now, I'm strictly going to be talking about international flights because that's what I have most experience with. I start looking for international flights as soon as I know that I'm going to be taking the international trip. So say if I know 6 months prior, then I will start looking 6 months before. Sometimes you just find a deal that's too good to pass up. So the sooner you start looking, the better. They say that that you should be booking your international flight at least 6 weeks before you depart. I would say start looking as soon as you know, but at least 6 weeks. Okay, tip number 6, fly with a budget airline. This is something that I've been recently doing in the past couple of years. Prior to that, I would always fly with Lufthansa, KLM, you know, big companies. Not to say these budget airlines aren't big companies, but they're not as well known as some of the bigger guys. So basically, what a budget airline is you're giving up something you might not need for a cheaper price. For example, I flew with an airline called Norwegian Air, and I gave up a meal, on-flight meal. I gave up having a checked bag, and I gave up having a seat reservation, so I couldn't choose my own seat, but I was flying alone, so I didn't really care where I was sitting. But if I were flying with a friend, then I would want to book my seat next to the person, so I would be sitting next to the person. But since I was traveling solo, I gave up all those luxuries for a cheaper flight. I got an international flight from New York to Berlin for around $420. Some budget airlines are Norwegian Air, of course, that is my personal favorite. WOW Air is what I mentioned earlier, where you have a stopover in Iceland, or you can choose to have a stopover in Iceland. Those two are really great for international travel. For travel in Europe, Ryanair and EasyJet. Just remember to check in and print out your boarding passes before you get to the airport, or they will charge you a hefty fine. That's how they make their money, by charging people for every little thing. Now, I don't think they would charge you for going to the bathroom, but it's pretty close. They'll charge you for a seat, for a checked bag, they'll charge you for a meal, they'll charge you if you didn't print your boarding pass, they'll charge you if your bag is like the slightest bit overweight, they'll charge you if your personal bag is too big, they'll charge you if your personal bag is too overweight, they'll charge you for everything. So you really have to master these budget airlines like Ryanair and EasyJet, because they are actually a lot stricter than other airlines, because that's how they make their money. If you're flying domestically in the US, Spirit Airlines is very cheap. I have never personally flown with them because they don't fly out of my city, but I've looked on their website and their fares are actually pretty reasonable. Another airline that I have flown with quite a few times is Southwest Airlines. Now, some say that Southwest isn't really a budget airline anymore because their prices have gone up the past few years, but if you look out for some deals, they always have deals going on. You can actually get a pretty cheap ticket. The only downside with Southwest is that the seats are basically first come, first serve, unless you pay to go into the airplane a little sooner than everybody else. So if you're a big group of people, or even if you're just 3 or 4 people, you might not end up sitting next to each other because you might be the last boarding group and all the seats may have already been filled up. So that's a downside to that. But other than that, I've flown Southwest and they're awesome. Oh, and also with Southwest, you get 2 free checked bags. You get to keep your carry-on and you get a personal item. So that's more than enough than anyone would ever need. Tip number 7, create an email, a separate email specifically for travel, and sign up for every email subscription service that airlines offer, because if you do that, they'll send you promotions sometimes before others get them. You'll get notified when they have sales, and sometimes they may even send you coupon codes or rebates. Tip number 8 is collect miles. I've collected tons of miles over the years, and not just from flying. Recently, I opened a credit card. Now I know some of you are younger, you can't open a credit card, or you don't want to open a credit card, but honestly, credit cards with airlines, I've just recently discovered this, have so much more benefits than I could have imagined. I opened a credit card with Delta. I flew Delta from Austin to New York, as I was saying earlier. I got my bag checked for free, even though I was already going to get my bag checked from New York to Berlin with Air Berlin. Flying domestically in the US, you usually don't get a free checked bag unless it's Southwest, but with this credit card, I got a free checked bag, I got priority boarding, felt good. And if I spend $1,000 in purchases in the next 3 months, then I get 30,000 miles, which is enough for another domestic flight and maybe even farther. It's a pretty good deal, and pretty much every airline has a deal like this going on constantly, but Delta was just the one that I chose this time. There are also other ways to collect miles, such as filling out surveys online on erewards.com or emiles.com. You can fill out surveys and they basically give you miles for any airline that you choose. Other ways of collecting miles are signing sign up for frequent flyer programs for every airline that you fly. Even if it's just a small flight, you can start adding up points and using them in the future. Okay, that was it for the tips and tricks. Now I'm just going to list a couple websites that I use to find some cheap flights. The first one is Skyscanner.com. What's cool about Skyscanner is that you enter your airport, then when it asks where you're going, you can choose an option called flexible. Now be sure to enter the dates that you want. You can play around with the dates, but when you enter flexible, it basically lists cities from your airport from cheapest to most expensive during the dates that you've chose. So if you play around with the dates, if you're flexible, you can actually find really cheap flights, and it tells you basically what destination is cheapest. So you're basically choosing your fare and not choosing the destination. The next website is Airfare Watchdog.com. If you're looking at a very specific fare, then you can get notifications from Airfare Watchdog when that fare has gone down or gone up in price. It's a really cool tool to use if you really want a specific flight, but you're not ready to buy it today. Maybe you want to buy it next week. You can get email notifications and they'll send you updates when the flight price goes up or down. The last website I recommend is Twitter. I follow this Twitter account called @EscapeATX, and basically they post when they've found a low fare from my airport, so from Austin, Texas. But there are Twitter accounts for so many cities and you can easily find one. They do all the work for you. If you're planning on going somewhere last minute, just follow a Twitter account from your city. If you turn on the notifications for that Twitter account, then you can get direct notifications onto your phone from these Twitter accounts and be notified 24/7 when a really cheap flight is available. So that was it for the tips and tricks and websites that I've learned to use over the years to find the cheapest flights. I hope you found it useful. And if you have any tips and tricks that you've learned to use over the years, leave a comment down below and share it with me and the rest of the YouTube community. Thanks for watching. Bye!